If you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read it, you're misinformed.
Who you wound up supporting in the election, presidential election?
None of your business.
How are we going to get rid of racism?
Stop talking about it.
They were told to fall in line and repeat the script. When the moment came to perform outrage, signal virtue, or pledge allegiance to the latest cultural trend, they refused, not loudly or angrily, but with calm confidence that rattled the room. This video explores old-school celebrities who challenged wokeness without rants or insults, simply by not playing the game. From Denzel Washington drawing firm boundaries, to Morgan Freeman puncturing identity politics with one question, to insiders revealing how ideology replaced art. This isn't politics, it's independence, and why restraint, silence, and honesty became dangerous weapons of our cultural moment. None of your business. Denzel Washington and the power of refusal. When Denzel Washington was asked who he voted for in the presidential election, the question hung in the air with the usual weight of political expectation. Celebrities, particularly those in Hollywood, are often seen as public figures whose opinions should be given freely, as if they owe the public transparency into every detail of their lives. They are supposed to align with the prevailing cultural narratives, signal virtue to the masses, and reinforce whatever political or social stance is in vogue at any given moment. It's an unspoken contract that comes with fame. In exchange for your wealth, attention, and influence, you'll play the part, answer the questions, and toe the line. But Denzel Washington wasn't interested in playing along. Instead of rushing to conform, Denzel took a beat. He paused, and with a calm and composed demeanor, he shut down the entire exchange with 5 simple words. None of your business. There was no sarcasm, no biting tone, no defensive wall built around him. His voice wasn't tinged with anger or frustration. It wasn't a rant or a lecture about the state of politics or the media. It was just a boundary, clean, clear, and perfectly set. None of your business. In a moment when everyone around him expected the usual performative responses, Denzel simply stated what was, in essence, the most radical statement of all. Some things are private. His response was jarring because it was so uncomplicated. In an era where public figures are expected to disclose every belief, every vote, every feeling, every personal revelation for mass consumption, Denzel's decision to simply refuse to comply reminded everyone of something fundamental. Privacy is not a political statement. The very notion that someone would simply say no felt like a quiet rebellion against a culture that increasingly demands access to every corner of one's personal life. When the journalist tried to prod further, pivoting the conversation to policy matters, Denzel didn't bite. The question now was, what issue did he hope the incoming president would tackle first? And again, Denzel's answer was unexpectedly grounded in humility. Instead of offering a quick opinion on the country's many problems or attempting to force a neatly packaged response, Denzel admitted, "I don't know." There was no false confidence in the face of a nation's issues. No grandstanding or false promises. He simply said he wasn't informed enough to pick one issue over another. Education, jobs, healthcare. He mentioned them, but with no intention of giving them the force of a simple answer. These were, after all, complex issues, not slogans or quick fixes. Leadership, Denzel suggested, was about careful thought, not rushing to opine for the sake of appearances. But it wasn't just about a single moment or a series of questions about political matters. The conversation took a deeper turn when the topic shifted to race relations in America. Denzel could have recited any number of talking points, cited statistics, or echoed the frustrations of the moment. Instead, he spoke plainly from a place of experience. "You can't legislate love," he said simply, challenging the widely held belief that political and legal systems can fix the cultural rifts between people. In that moment, he rejected the notion that laws or government mandates could magically heal deep-rooted divides. He rejected the idea that unity could be forced or dictated from the top down. The power of connection, he argued, came from individuals who stepped forward, who dared to engage, not hide behind laws, labels, or preconceived ideas. If we truly want to make progress, Denzel suggested, it starts in the way we interact with one another, not in the way we argue with politicians or in how we sensationalize every issue in the media. For many viewers, Denzel's words weren't just a dismissal of the political games. They were a call for something far more rare in today's discourse: independent thought. In a time when celebrity opinions are treated as scripture by millions, Denzel's refusal to toe the line spoke volumes. It wasn't a rejection of social causes. It was a rejection of the assumption that celebrities like him should be forced to adopt one-size-fits-all opinions that match the prevailing cultural winds. He showed the world that it was still possible to say, "This is who I am," without feeling the need to be part of a group or a movement. It wasn't anti-woke, it was anti-tribalism. It was a quiet stand for personal autonomy and the right to think for oneself. Morgan Freeman and the question nobody wanted answered. If Denzel Washington's refusal to align with the cultural expectations surrounding his political opinions was a quiet protest, Morgan Freeman took it a step further. His challenge wasn't just to the political establishment or the media. It was to the very language of identity and the labels that society continually imposed on people. Freeman had long been known for his calming presence and measured wisdom, but one of his most powerful moments came during an interview on 60 Minutes when he was asked about Black History Month. The interviewer, Mike Wallace, clearly expected a different response. It's a question that many Black public figures have been asked, as if it's some sort of ritual for Black leaders to either agree with or defend the existence of a month dedicated to highlighting Black history. But Freeman didn't comply. He didn't raise his voice or get defensive. He simply asked the interviewer, "Black History Month? You find that ridiculous?" Wallace, unsure how to respond, asked why Freeman felt that way. The answer was sharp, direct, and revealing. "You're going to relegate my history to a month?" Freeman didn't just question the concept. He rejected it outright. Black history wasn't something to be separated from American history. It was the foundation of it. "Black history is American history," Freeman said with the same calm assurance he carried through his career. His point was simple. Why should an entire people's story be separated, boxed off, and given its own month, when, in Freeman's eyes, it was embedded in every part of the nation's history? But Freeman's next move turned the conversation from merely provocative to uncomfortable for many. He didn't just stop at challenging the concept of Black History Month. He flipped the script entirely and asked a question nobody seemed prepared for. Which month is White History Month? Wallace hesitated, as did most of the audience. Freeman wasn't done. What about Jewish history? Which month is that? There was a long pause. Wallace stammered slightly, but Freeman didn't press further. The silence was enough. For Freeman, this wasn't an attempt to erase the importance of race or heritage or the struggles that defined generations. His argument was that constantly separating people by their race was, in itself, part of the problem. Every year, the same cycle. A month dedicated to Black history, a month for this, a month for that. But never a true reckoning of the fact that history is interconnected. People should be viewed as individuals first, not defined by external labels. And then came the statement that resonated deeply. "I'll stop calling you a white man," Freeman said, "and I'll ask you to stop calling me a black man." In a world obsessed with racial identity, Freeman's words struck like a thunderclap. He wasn't advocating for forgetting history or pretending that racism didn't exist. He was advocating for something even more radical, seeing people as people first. It was a call to look beyond labels, to engage in direct human conversation without the barriers of race constantly dictating how we perceive one another. His suggestion wasn't about erasing or ignoring, it was about breaking down the walls that divided people in favor of common ground. As Freeman's words sunk in, the reality of what he was proposing began to feel profoundly uncomfortable to some. It challenged the structure of modern activism, which often thrives on amplifying divides in the name of unity. Freeman's insistence on the individuality of people, rather than the summation of their race, forced people to confront the question, what happens when we stop dividing ourselves and start seeing one another as equals on every level? Freeman wasn't shouting. He wasn't angry. He didn't raise his voice once. He spoke with quiet conviction, and that, perhaps, is why his words were so powerful. He wasn't trying to force anyone into his viewpoint. He wasn't preaching. He was simply asking for something basic: respect for one another as human beings, beyond color, beyond categories. It was a quiet challenge, and perhaps one of the most potent forms of rebellion in an age where everything is politicized. In Freeman's world, the labels didn't define him, and they shouldn't define anyone else. If you read it, you're misinformed. Denzel Washington versus the media machine. By the time Denzel Washington began speaking openly about misinformation, the damage was already done. News was no longer news. It had become a race. Who could be first? Who could be loudest? Who could provoke the strongest reaction before anyone had time to think? Denzel didn't attack the media with rage. He didn't accuse journalists of conspiracies or corruption. Instead, he asked a question so simple it felt almost embarrassing that no one else had asked it out loud. What is the long-term effect of too much information? He wasn't talking about ignorance. He was talking about overload. About a culture so flooded with headlines, opinions, alerts, and outrage cycles that truth itself became optional. In his view, the problem wasn't that people weren't informed, it was that they were drowning in information without context, discernment, or accountability. He pointed out something uncomfortable. What we call news today is often just opinion dressed up as urgency. Panels stacked with experts shouting over one another. Narratives packaged for speed instead of accuracy. Stories pushed live before they're verified, because being right matters less than being first. And then came the line that lingered. If you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you read it, you're misinformed. It wasn't cynicism. It was a warning. Denzel explained that repetition turns even false ideas into perceived truth. Say something enough times, circulate it fast enough, amplify it through enough screens, and people stop questioning it. The device in your hand stops serving you. You start serving it. Are you using your phone? He asked. Or is your phone using you? This wasn't an anti-technology rant. He made that clear. It was a call for responsibility, for slowing down, for understanding that information, when consumed without reflection, doesn't enlighten, it polarizes. The media, he argued, had abandoned its duty to protect truth in favor of profit and speed. And when accuracy stops mattering, collateral damage becomes inevitable. Reputations are destroyed, families are hurt, communities fracture, and nobody takes responsibility. Because by the time the truth emerges, The outrage has already moved on. Anything you practice, Denzel warned, you get good at, including misinformation. And in a culture that practices outrage every single day, the consequences are not theoretical. They are already here. It starts in the house. The conversation no one wanted about responsibility. Few topics ignite emotion faster than systemic racism, and few conversations are shut down more aggressively than those that challenge the idea that systems alone are to blame for every outcome. When Denzel Washington was asked about incarceration rates and inequality, many expected a familiar answer, one centered entirely on the failures of the legal system. What they got instead was something far more unsettling. By the time the system gets involved, he said, the damage is already done. They're not locking up 7-year-olds. The statement landed hard. Denzel wasn't denying systemic flaws. In fact, he openly acknowledged that the system is rigged. But he refused to stop there. Because focusing only on the system, he argued, ignores the earlier failures, the ones that happen long before courts, police, or prisons enter the picture. He told a story that froze the room. An 11-year-old boy, known as Lil Yummy, killed and then killed himself by older teenagers. A child caught in violence before he ever had a chance to become anything else. The question Denzel asked wasn't political. It was personal. Where was his father? That question made people uncomfortable because it shifted responsibility from abstract forces to human relationships, from institutions to households, from policies to parenting. Denzel spoke from experience. He talked about his own upbringing, about his closest friends, men who ended up serving decades in prison. The difference, Beba, he said quietly, wasn't intelligence or opportunity. It was presence. He had a father, they didn't. Even when his parents separated, there was still guidance, discipline, and example. When trouble came, his parents intervened. They redirected him. They protected him from becoming another statistic. We were all doing enough to get locked up at 13, he admitted. But someone stepped in. That, he argued, is where real change begins. Not in slogans, not in blaming faceless systems, but in families, accountability, and early intervention. Blaming the system after the damage is done might feel righteous, but it doesn't save the next child. And that is why this message was so dangerous to certain audiences, because it removed the comfort of victimhood without denying injustice, because it demanded responsibility without erasing compassion, because it asked people to fix what they can control, instead of endlessly condemning what they cannot. In a culture increasingly allergic to personal accountability, that message hit like a violation of unspoken rules. Joe Rogan, universities, and the price of saying no. While Hollywood wrestled with ideology and media credibility, another battleground was quietly imploding: universities. Joe Rogan didn't invent this conversation, but he amplified it. And when he sat down with evolutionary biologist Brett Weinstein, the story that unfolded wasn't about politics. It was about consequences. Weinstein described how a long-standing campus event known as the Day of Absence was transformed. What began decades earlier as a voluntary event evolved into something mandatory, first encouraged, then enforced. Eventually, white faculty were explicitly asked not to come to campus. Weinstein objected. Not loudly, not violently, not disrespectfully. He simply said no. At a public college, he argued, no one should be told they cannot teach based on skin color. That refusal ignited a firestorm: protests, accusations, administrative pressure, and eventually, exile. But the problem went deeper than a single event. Weinstein explained that university leadership had begun reshaping hiring policies around ideological compliance. Faculty positions were no longer about expertise alone. Candidates had to justify their value based on activism, on how their presence would address inequity. The implication was chilling. What happens to mathematics when math isn't allowed to just be math? What happens to chemistry when activism matters more than competence? Even worse, Weinstein argued, these policies actively harmed the very people they claimed to help. Exceptional individuals were no longer celebrated for their brilliance. They were absorbed into identity categories that flattened achievement and discouraged excellence. Instead of lifting people up, the system dragged them into boxes. Rogan listened carefully, recognizing a familiar pattern. Institutions designed to pursue truth had begun enforcing conformity. Dissent wasn't debated, it was punished. And the irony was impossible to ignore. In the name of inclusion, exclusion had become policy. Universities, once the safest places for disagreement, had become some of the most ideologically fragile institutions in society. And the cost wasn't theoretical. Careers ended, reputations burned, and students learned a devastating lesson: not how to think, but what not to say. Quentin Tarantino and the moment Hollywood stopped being about movies. By the time Quentin Tarantino finally said what many in Hollywood only whispered behind closed doors, the transformation of the industry was already complete. What once rewarded risk, obsession, and raw storytelling had quietly shifted into something safer, flatter, and far more controlled. When Tarantino appeared on a talk show and was asked about the current state of Hollywood, his response was blunt. Ideology is more important than art. Way more. That sentence alone landed like a grenade. Not because it was shocking, but because it articulated what audiences had been feeling for years, but couldn't quite name. Movies weren't failing because of lack of talent or budget. They were failing because storytelling had been subordinated to moral signaling. Tarantino didn't stop there. He explained that modern Hollywood increasingly rewards only two types of films. There's two kinds of movies now: virtue signalers and superhero movies. In one category, films exist to demonstrate ideological correctness. In the other, they exist to distract. What's missing is the space where uncomfortable, morally complex, human stories used to live. To Tarantino, this wasn't new. It was cyclical. He pointed to earlier eras of cinema to explain what happens when fear governs art. He referenced the post-war 1950s, saying, "Every bestseller, every play that was turned into a movie, if there was anything sexual or controversial, it was drained out." The result, he argued, was one of the weakest decades in Hollywood history. Not because filmmakers lacked skill, but because the culture punished honesty. What made Tarantino's critique especially dangerous wasn't just what he said, it was that he refused to apologize for it. In a media environment where public figures are expected to retract, clarify, or repent, Tarantino did none of those things. He spoke as someone who had already earned the freedom most artists never get. And that's what unsettled Hollywood, because his words exposed a truth many insiders understood. Censorship no longer needed to be enforced from the top. Fear had already done the job. Writers were pre-editing their own ideas. Directors were avoiding entire themes. Studios were selecting stories based not on power, but on safety. Tarantino didn't present himself as a rebel. He presented himself as a witness. And in doing so, he revealed that Hollywood hadn't lost its talent. It had lost its nerve. Matthew McConaughey and the refusal to be framed. Matthew McConaughey's confrontation with modern media framing didn't come with raised voices or outrage. It came with something far more disruptive: calm refusal. After delivering a nationally praised speech calling for responsible gun ownership, mental health investment, and reasonable firearm regulations, McConaughey found himself facing a familiar trap on live television. A host asked him bluntly, "Do you think you could get elected in Texas being anti-gun?" The question wasn't neutral. It wasn't curious. It was a framing device, one designed to collapse a nuanced position into a hostile label. McConaughey immediately saw it. He paused, then responded, "If me in politics is to give you a direct statement right there, that's playing a game I'm not interested in playing." That moment mattered more than most people realized. He wasn't dodging the question. He was rejecting the manipulation behind it. Earlier, McConaughey had already been clear about his position. He had said, "We need responsible gun ownership." Responsible gun owners are fed up with the Second Amendment being abused. These were not radical statements. They were measured, practical, and grounded. But in a media ecosystem built on conflict, moderation is dangerous because it can't be easily attacked. Rather than defending himself against a label he never claimed, McConaughey reframed the entire exchange. He explained that leadership isn't about fitting into categories, but about being useful. "I will always measure what category I can be most useful." That sentence cut against the grain of modern political theater. It rejected performative allegiance. It rejected identity-based assumptions. It rejected the idea that every public figure must declare themselves for or against a tribe. What made this moment powerful wasn't what McConaughey said, it was what he refused to say. He didn't reassure the audience. He didn't posture. He didn't overcorrect. He simply declined to be simplified. And in doing so, he exposed how much of modern discourse depends on forcing people into boxes small enough to attack. McConaughey didn't destroy wokeness with anger. He did it with discipline, with patience, with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that truth doesn't need to shout, and that refusing a dishonest frame is sometimes the most honest answer available. When silence became the loudest protest. By the time the cultural noise reached its peak, something unexpected began to happen. While activists shouted and social media demanded statements, some of the most respected figures in Hollywood did the opposite. They stopped performing. They stopped explaining themselves. And in that refusal, they exposed just how fragile the entire moment had become. Denzel Washington had already shown the world what that kind of quiet resistance looked like. Standing before reporters in Washington, D.C., the atmosphere was tense, charged with expectation. The journalist leaned in and asked the question everyone was supposed to answer. "Who did you wind up supporting in the election?" Denzel didn't smile. He didn't bristle. He didn't launch into a speech. He simply looked back and said, calmly and without apology, "None of your business." The reporter tried again, reframing it, insisting. Denzel didn't move an inch. "None of my business. None of your business." No anger, no virtue signal. Just a boundary, clearly drawn. In a culture that thrives on forced transparency, that moment landed like a shockwave. Moments later, another question followed, softer in tone but just as loaded. What issue did he hope the incoming president would tackle first? This was where outrage was expected, where certainty was required. Instead, Denzel paused and admitted something almost forbidden in modern discourse. "I don't know," he said. "I'd have to be more informed to say off the top of my head." No pretending, no posturing, just honesty. But it was when the conversation turned to race that his words cut deepest. Asked whether race relations had improved, Denzel didn't speak about policy or presidents. He spoke about people. Race relationships have to do with race relationships, he explained. You're white or whatever you are. I'm black or whatever. We're standing here talking now. That's how we get things done. Then came the line that stripped away decades of political theater in one breath. You can't legislate love. It wasn't denial. It wasn't dismissal. It was a reminder that no law, no slogan, no administration could force human connection. That work had to be done face to face, quietly, imperfectly. Years earlier, Morgan Freeman had delivered a similar message, though the room he was in felt very different. Sitting across from Mike Wallace on 60 Minutes, the question sounded harmless enough. What did he think of Black History Month? You find it ridiculous? Wallace asked. Freeman didn't raise his voice. He didn't laugh it off. He leaned forward slightly and asked, "You're going to relegate my history to a month?" Wallace pushed back, asking which month Freeman would prefer. Freeman shook his head. "I don't want one." The exchange grew uncomfortable. Wallace tried again. Freeman turned the question around. "Which month is White History Month?" There was silence. Then Freeman delivered the line that still unsettles people decades later. Black history is American history. And when Wallace asked how racism would ever end, Freeman answered without hesitation. "Stop talking about it." When Wallace objected, Freeman clarified, not with hostility, but with precision. "I'm going to stop calling you a white man," he said. "And I'm going to ask you to stop calling me a black man. I know you as Mike Wallace. You know me as Morgan Freeman." Two men from different generations, different paths, delivering the same quiet rebellion. They didn't deny history. They refused to live inside labels. They didn't shout down their critics. They didn't chase applause. They simply spoke as individuals and let the weight of their words do the rest. What made these moments so powerful wasn't that they were controversial. It was that they were calm. In a culture addicted to outrage, restraint became radical, silence became subversive, and humility, the willingness to say, "I don't know," or "that's not your business," became an act of defiance. They didn't announce a war on wokeness. They didn't need to. By refusing the script, they revealed it. And in doing so, they reminded the world of something it had nearly forgotten. Not every battle is won by shouting. Some are won by standing still and refusing to move. The quiet rebellion that changed the conversation. What ultimately unsettled people wasn't that these figures disagreed with the dominant cultural narrative. It was that they refused to fight it on its terms. There were no hashtags, no viral rants, no dramatic exits from interviews. Instead, there was something far more destabilizing: composure, boundaries, a refusal to perform outrage on command. In a moment when the loudest voices were rewarded and the most extreme positions traveled fastest, these men chose stillness. Denzel Washington chose to say, without apology, that some questions did not deserve answers. Morgan Freeman chose to say that progress did not come from dividing history into boxes, but from recognizing shared humanity. Others followed in different ways, by questioning the media's obsession with speed over truth, by rejecting ideological checklists in art, by refusing to reduce complex human lives to slogans that fit neatly on a screen. What tied these moments together was not politics, it was maturity. They spoke like people who had lived long enough to understand that moral authority doesn't come from volume, and that wisdom rarely survives when it's rushed. They understood something that much of modern discourse has forgotten. Not every issue needs an instant opinion, not every silence is cowardice, and not every refusal is an act of hostility. Sometimes, refusal is clarity. This quiet rebellion didn't dominate headlines the way outrage cycles do. It didn't trend for weeks or inspire endless reaction videos, but it did something more enduring. It gave people permission to pause, permission to think, permission to disengage from conversations designed less to seek truth and more to force alignment. And that may be the most subversive act of all. Because when the noise finally fades, what remains isn't the loudest argument or the sharpest insult. What remains are the moments of restraint, the words spoken carefully, the silences that refused to be filled. In a culture that thrives on constant declaration, choosing when not to speak became a form of leadership. Not because it ended the culture war, but because it exposed how much of it was theater. And once people see the script, it becomes much harder to believe the performance. If this video made you pause, rethink, or see these moments differently, hit the like button. It helps more than you think. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into culture, media, and moments that didn't just trend but endured.